A hard winter sun bled through the blinds, casting stripes across the pale linoleum of Dr. Ellison's office in Sheridan, Wyoming. The heater's rattle was the only sound. Clayton Reeves sat stiff-backed in the exam chair, his cowboy hat cradled in his gnarled hands. At 72, his shoulders were still wide, but his chest rose in shallow, crackling breaths. The air carried the scent of antiseptic and quiet dread. Dr. Ellison, barely old enough to remember rotary phones, didn't bother with small talk. He just placed a weathered hand on Clayton's shoulder and met his eyes. "Mr. Reeves, I wish I had better news. It's terminal, stage 4. I'd say 4 months, give or take." Time dilated, the words echoing in the hush of the sterile room. Clayton barely blinked. His fingers squeezed the hat brim so tight his knuckles went white. For a long moment, the doctor didn't say another word. He just let the weight of it settle, that silent, ancient question lingering. "Is there something left you need to do?" Clayton stood up, nodding once. "Thank you, Doc." His voice sounded like boot leather, dry, cracked, carrying a life spent in wind and dust. He strode out, the automatic door hissing shut behind him. Outside, winter clawed at his skin. The sky was a cold slab of steel. Clayton's battered Ford pickup waited by the curb, paint flaked by decades of sun and grit. He got in, the springs protesting, and sat for a minute, hands locked on the steering wheel, heart thudding behind his ribs. On the drive home, the Wyoming mountains rose, blue and indifferent, behind the snow-brushed prairie. The road wound higher, where the pines thickened and the radio faded into static. Every mile seemed to pull him back into himself, into memories buried deeper than the ice-crusted earth. At the cabin, dust danced in a shaft of afternoon light. The place was more storage than home now. Photo frames turned face down, his wife's old rocking chair covered in a wool blanket, her ghost hovering in the hush. He moved through the small rooms like a man walking underwater, every step heavy with what was left unsaid. In the back closet, behind boxes of faded Christmas decorations and empty mason jars, Clayton reached for something he hadn't touched in years. His old .30-30 Winchester, its wood worn smooth from a lifetime of use. He set it gently on the bed. Then the battered tackle box, still smelling faintly of rust and animal musk, and finally a faded topographic map, its creases darkened by sweat and oil. There, marked with a single bold X, was the place. The old trapline, deep in the Absaroka Range, where the snowdrifts swallowed the tracks of men and beasts alike. He sat on the edge of the bed, rifle across his knees, the map spread out like a secret. There was a tremor in his hand as he traced the route with a calloused finger, the ink almost worn away by years of weather and regret. "One last journey," he muttered, the words tasting of iron and memory. "Time to end things my own way." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window pane. Clayton packed quietly. Traps, ammunition, a hunting knife, canteen, a coil of rope, a dented flask half full of bourbon. Every item seemed to carry a ghost. He ran his thumb across the initials carved in the rifle stock, his own and his son's, carved so long ago it looked like another life. In the fading light, he wrote a quick note on the kitchen table just in case. "Gone to the hills. Don't come looking." No signature. He knew no one would. As darkness fell, he checked the fire, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The wind whipped down from the mountains, sharp as old memories. He looked back at the cabin, its windows yellow squares in the blue dusk, and wondered if he'd ever see it again. Then he turned, map in his pocket. rifle in hand, and disappeared into the rising dark, dust swirling at his heels. The first step off the porch was like stepping through a curtain. The world changed. Snow, brittle and crusted, bit through the thin leather of Clayton's boots. The mountain air burned his lungs, cold and sharp, every breath a reminder of the ticking clock in his chest. He hiked upward, past the skeletal aspen groves, through drifts that reached his knees. The weight of his pack pressed on his shoulders, familiar as guilt. The pines thickened, muffling the world into a hush, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the wheeze of his breath. Each step forward, Clayton felt the years rolling back. The wilderness was old, older than any man's memory. Tracks crossed the snow, rabbit, deer, a fox's narrow line vanishing under a fallen log. Once, he'd been able to read the land like a diary. Which branch the bobcat brushed, where the elk had bedded down, how long since a wolf passed. He squinted, fighting the blurriness in his left eye, still tracing the faintest sign. Memories came unbidden. He saw himself as a young man, lean and wild, moving through the forest with a hunter's purpose and hunger. He remembered the pride in the weight of a full trap, the feel of warm animal hide, the triumph of mastering the untamable world. He also remembered the blood, the panic in the eyes of a wounded creature, the quiet afterward. A woman's voice echoed in the hush, so real he almost turned around. "Do you hunt for food or to control?" Mary. Gone these 7 winters, but sometimes out here. Her voice still rode the wind. Clayton's jaw clenched. He remembered the way she'd watched him from the porch when he'd bring home pelts, her hands curled around a mug, her gaze never quite meeting his. She'd asked that question more than once, always soft, never judging, just asking, and he'd never had a good answer. The trail steepened. He paused to catch his breath, resting against a tree scarred by old bear claws. Above, gray clouds threatened more snow. The sky pressed down low. He pulled his scarf higher, forcing himself onward. A memory stabbed through, sharp as a knife. Him and his son, Eli, on this very mountain. Eli, barely 12, bright-eyed and eager, wanting so much to make his father proud. The way Clayton had taught him to set a snare, to move quiet, to shoot straight. Eli's hands, small and cold, cupped around a steaming can of beans by the campfire. But memory soured. He saw Eli that last morning, pale and silent, staring at the bloody form of the pregnant doe Clayton had shot by mistake. The look on the boy's face, horror, disappointment, something breaking, had haunted Clayton for years. They'd argued, voices echoing through the trees. Eli left that night, stormed down the mountain alone, refusing even to look back. 15 years gone. Clayton hadn't seen or heard from his son since, except for the barest note after Mary's funeral, unsigned but unmistakable in its distance. Clayton stumbled, breath ragged. For a moment, the mountain seemed to close in, the weight of grief and regret heavier than his pack. He sagged to one knee, coughing into his glove, tasting the metallic tang of blood. His chest burned, every breath a reminder that time was running out. But stubbornness ran deep. He pushed up, spitting blood into the snow. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and cold water. He followed an old deer trail, winding up through the trees, past an outcrop of stone. Overhead, a raven cried, a harsh, mocking sound that rang in the hush. He set up camp in the lee of a boulder, sweat freezing on his back as he unpacked his bedroll and lit a fire. The orange glow flickered on the snow, throwing long, dancing shadows among the trees. Clayton sat with his back to the stone, knees drawn up, staring into the flames. The wilderness pressed close, a living thing. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and a pair of owls called to each other across the ravine. Above, stars glittered sharp and cold, indifferent to the dramas of men. Clayton pulled the battered map from his pocket, tracing the route again, feeling the ache in his bones. The X was close now, maybe a day's hike, 2 at most. His hands trembled, whether from cold or memory he wasn't sure. He stared into the fire, haunted by ghosts. Mary's soft voice, Eli's accusing eyes, the creatures he'd hunted, and the man he'd become. Regret twisted inside him, but beneath it, a flicker of resolve burned brighter than the coals. He didn't know if there was forgiveness at the end of this trail, or even what he hoped to find. But something inside him insisted. You finish what you start. You face what you've done. The wind rattled the branches, snow drifting down like ash. Clayton rolled onto his side, pulling his coat tight, and closed his eyes. The darkness pressed in, thick with memories, some tender, some cruel, all inescapable. Tomorrow he'd reach the X. Tomorrow he'd see if a man could change, even at the end. But tonight, the mountain held him close, cradling his old wounds, as if the land itself remembered every step, every mistake, every hope he still dared to carry. Dawn broke slow and gray, seeping through the thick canopy and ribbons of pewter light. Clayton stirred from uneasy sleep, muscles aching and chest heavy, the fire little more than a ring of embers buried under last night's ash. He stretched, coughed, sharp and deep, then stilled, listening. In these high mountains, silence itself felt like another living thing, full of secrets and warnings. He broke camp methodically, packing up as the world around him held its breath. The map's X was close, so close the trees themselves seemed to crowd in, eager witnesses to his private reckoning. Each step deeper into the snowbound forest brought a fresh rush of memories and a tightening sense of unease, as if the land was waiting for something to happen. Clayton moved slow, senses sharpened by decades of tracking and caution. The crunch of snow under his boots, the subtle shift of wind, the occasional rustle from the underbrush. These were things he understood, as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. But beneath that surface rhythm pulsed a new anxiety, a wildness he hadn't felt since youth. Mid-morning, he paused at a bend where an ancient pine sprawled across a frozen creek, its gnarled roots thrust up like grasping fingers. He scanned for tracks. Rabbit, coyote, maybe even the faint, heavy drag of a mountain lion. The world seemed suspended, poised on the edge of something. That's when he heard it. A sound so raw, so guttural, it punched through the hush like a wound torn in the world. It was a cry, not quite animal, not quite human, but ringing with agony and terror. It clawed up from beneath the roots of the fallen pine, echoing through the snow-saddled silence. Clayton's heart hammered in his chest. He gripped the rifle tighter, finger brushing the trigger. Every nerve blazed awake, every sense screaming danger. He crept forward, boot by careful boot, sweeping the area with a hunter's precision. Again came the cry, deeper now, more desperate, followed by the sound of frantic thrashing, the scrape of claws against wood and stone. Clayton's breath fogged the cold air. He inched closer, half expecting to find a bear, a wolf, or worse, some half-starved mountain man driven mad by winter. Instead, he found something else. Wedged deep beneath the massive roots, caught in the black jaws of an ancient iron trap, was a full-grown bobcat. Its fur, matted with blood and filth, once gold and proud, bristled along a spine arched in pain. Its leg was mangled, bone exposed, flesh torn raw. The creature's chest heaved, breath rasping like dry leaves, and its eyes, amber, wild, furious, locked with Clayton's, burning with a mix of terror, accusation, and a hatred so pure it made him flinch. For a long moment, neither moved. Clayton stared down the rifle barrel at the creature, every instinct screaming to end its suffering, to finish what the trap had started. He could see the animal's muscles trembling, the pain etched in every line of its powerful body. The snow beneath the trap was painted red. He knelt, just out of reach of those razor claws. The bobcat hissed, baring its teeth, tail lashing. Clayton's hands shook, not from cold, but from something older, deeper. Guilt, shame, memory. He saw, in that desperate animal's gaze, every wild thing he'd ever pursued, every choice that had brought him to this lonely place. The rifle felt heavy. He raised it, breath held, sights lined up on the animal's broad chest. The bobcat's gaze never wavered, its body taut with the last thread of strength. For a heartbeat, time stopped. In the reflection of that amber eye, Clayton saw himself, a tired old man, his own body failing, trapped by years of violence and pride. He thought of Mary, her question hanging in the cold. Do you hunt for food or to control? He thought of Eli and the way the boy had looked at him, all those years ago, when the killing had gone too far. A sharp wind swept the clearing, rattling the branches overhead. Clayton's finger tightened on the trigger, then paused. He lowered the rifle. The sound of it clicking off safety seemed to echo for miles. Instead, he reached for his knife, heart pounding, every motion slow and deliberate. The bobcat's growl deepened, but it was too weak to fight. Clayton studied the trap. Rusted, ancient, but still merciless, he braced himself, pried the iron jaws open with the blade and his free hand, the metal biting into his skin. The jaws gave with a creak and a snap. The bobcat yowled, scrambling back as far as its ruined leg would let it. Clayton dropped the knife, breathing hard. He watched as the animal collapsed, shivering, its golden eyes now glassy with exhaustion and pain. It didn't try to flee. It just lay there, breath ragged, foam at the corners of its mouth. Clayton's hands trembled as he tore a strip from his flannel shirt, wrapping the mangled limb as best he could. Blood seeped through the cloth, hot against his numb fingers. He worked in silence, his movements clumsy but careful. Each time the bobcat flinched, he paused, murmuring nonsense just to keep his own courage steady. When the wound was bound, he hesitated. He could walk away. He could end it with the rifle, quick and merciful. But some stubborn part of him, maybe guilt, maybe hope, wouldn't let go. He dug in his pack, pulled out an old wool blanket, and wrapped the animal as gently as he could. The bobcat's breathing slowed, its eyes half closed. It made no sound as Clayton lifted it in his arms, awkward, heavy, muscles twitching, and started the slow, slippery walk back toward his camp. Snow fell quietly, covering the tracks of man and beast alike. Behind them, the old iron trap snapped shut, empty now, lost to the wilderness once more. Back at camp, the fire had died to a faint orange core. Clayton struggled beneath the weight of the wounded bobcat, boots slipping on the crusted snow, breath clouding in the icy air. The animal lay limp in his arms, only a low, guttural growl now and then, betraying its pain and defiance. As Clayton set it gently down beside the fire, his own heart pounded in a way that felt new, raw, and urgent. Not the familiar adrenaline of the hunt, but a fierce, unfamiliar ache. He'd always thought himself ready for anything the wilderness could throw at him, but he'd never carried a living, wild thing like this. Not in mercy. Not for saving. He crouched beside the bobcat, rifle close but untouched, eyes flicking between the flames and the animal's labored chest. Each breath the creature took was shaky, edged with agony. Its golden eyes never left his, tracking his every move, half warning, half plea. The weight of the moment pressed on Clayton, heavy as the sky before a snowstorm. He reached for his battered first aid kit, hands trembling. The kit was old, barely holding together with cracked leather and faded stitching. Inside were supplies meant for men, bandages, whiskey, a rusty pair of tweezers. He worked carefully, biting back curses as he cleaned the ragged wound, his fingers numb from cold and nerves. The bobcat's fur was thick with blood and dirt. Clayton dabbed at the worst of it, with a strip of cloth soaked in melted snow and bourbon. The animal flinched, a deep, warning snarl rumbling from its throat, but it didn't try to strike. Maybe it was too tired. Maybe, Clayton thought, it understood, somehow, that he meant no harm. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, breath coming hard. The temptation to end its suffering was strong. The rifle was close, almost humming with old instinct. But Clayton couldn't lift it. Not this time. The act of mercy, the decision not to shoot, cost him more than he'd expected. It was easier, always, to be the hunter, to have control, to finish things quickly. Mercy required more. It meant sitting with pain, watching another creature suffer, shouldering the responsibility instead of running from it. He found himself talking quietly, as if to a child. "You got yourself in a mess, haven't you?" His voice was rough, but softer than it had been in years. "Don't blame you for hating me. Hell, I'd hate me too, after all the things I've done." The bobcat's ear twitched, eyes half-lidded in the firelight. Clayton sighed. "You remind me of my boy. Stubborn, wild, always looking for a way out." He checked the tourniquet on the mangled leg and tucked the animal deeper into the wool blanket. The fire popped and hissed. The cold pressed in from every side, but the little circle of light felt sacred, separate from the brutal world outside. As night settled in, the wind rose, howling down from the peaks. The tent flapped, the forest groaned, but in that small space between predator and prey, something shifted. Clayton sat back, knees aching, and watched the bobcat fight for every breath. Its eyes, once fierce, now clouded with exhaustion, searched his face for meaning, or maybe just for mercy. He poured a splash of bourbon into a tin cup, set it aside, and reached for his battered notebook. His hands hesitated over the page, pen hovering above a blank space that seemed to swallow the firelight. Finally, he scribbled a line, more confession than record. "I thought my gun was all I had left, but here I am, cleaning the blood of what I once hunted." He set the notebook down, hands trembling as the day's weight pressed upon him. He wasn't a man for prayers, not since Mary's passing, but tonight he found himself staring up at the sliver of moon, words caught in his throat. Maybe there was no forgiveness left for a man like him. Maybe this, here in the snow with a wounded wildcat, was as close as he'd get. Clayton fed the fire, then sat quietly, watching shadows dance on the tent walls. He listened to the rhythm of the bobcat's breathing, sometimes ragged, sometimes steady, as if the animal's fight for life kept his own heart going. A strange peace crept in, mingled with regret and sorrow. The hours dragged. He dozed, jerking awake at the slightest sound, a groan from the bobcat, a crack from the forest, the snap of frozen branches. Each time he checked the animal, whispering nonsense reassurances, surprised by the tenderness in his own voice. Near midnight, the wind died. Snowflakes drifted down, glowing like embers in the firelight. Clayton found himself stroking the bobcat's head, slow and gentle. The animal didn't resist. In the quiet, their breaths mingled, man and beast, both survivors of old wounds. The world outside was vast and merciless, but in that circle of fire and pain, Clayton felt something loosen in his chest, a letting go, a quiet, aching hope. He'd chosen not to kill. He'd chosen, at last, to care for what he'd once destroyed. He wondered if it was enough. The bobcat watched him, eyes reflecting the flames. No fear, just sorrow. A recognition between two creatures bound by pain, now joined by a fragile, stubborn thread of mercy. Tomorrow would come soon, with new decisions and new dangers, but tonight, Clayton stayed awake by the fire, keeping vigil over a life he couldn't save or fix, only witness. For the first time in years, he let himself believe that sometimes mercy was harder than violence, and sometimes that was what made it matter. Clayton's fire crackled low, barely holding back the cold that seeped through every seam of his battered tent. The night outside had grown black and absolute, a darkness so deep it pressed against the thin canvas like a living thing. Only the shifting orange of the flames painted any color on the world, throwing wild shadows against the trees and across Clayton's weathered face. The bobcat lay on the spare blanket, not moving except for the rise and fall of its side. Its breathing was ragged, rough, and every so often a tremor would jolt its battered frame. Clayton worked with the stubborn care of an old man who'd spent too long at the edge of things. Too many years fixing fences, patching up horses, and tending wounds, human or animal, in the Wyoming wilds. But there was a difference this time. This was not a horse with a stone in its hoof or a ranch dog with a torn ear. This was a wild thing, untamed and unbroken, a creature whose trust had never been given to men. Clayton set the first aid kit aside and leaned back on his heels. His breath steamed in the cold. For a while he just sat, hands draped across his knees, eyes not on the animal, but somewhere far off, someplace in memory where the nights had been warmer, the silences less haunted. He found himself speaking to the bobcat as he worked. "You know," he said softly, voice more gravel than sound, "I always thought I'd die with a rifle in my hand, and nothing but my own regrets to keep me company." He gave a dry laugh, just a huff of air. "Funny, huh? All this way, all those years. Turns out I'm sitting here patching up the very thing I spent my life chasing." The bobcat's ears twitched, eyes still fixed on him, unblinking and strange. For a moment, Clayton saw himself in those eyes. Hunted, cornered, desperate, not for life but for something harder, some piece of himself he'd lost. He tried to remember the last time he'd spoken so openly. Maybe to Mary, years ago, sitting by the fire after Eli had left. He could still see her face, the way the light had softened her features, the sadness that always hovered around her when he came back from the hills. "You hunt for food? Or to control?" she'd asked him once, turning a mug of coffee in her hands, not quite looking his way. He'd never answered. Maybe he hadn't known. Maybe he still didn't. He brushed his hand over the bobcat's flank, feeling the steady beat of its heart, fragile but insistent. "I'm sorry," he whispered, unsure if he meant it for the animal or for everyone else he'd hurt. "I really am. Not just for the trap. For, well, for everything. The words felt strange in his mouth. Confession wasn't something he was used to. But tonight the darkness invited honesty, and the flames flickered as if hungry for secrets. Clayton poured a splash of bourbon into the tin cup, set it between them. He didn't know if the animal would drink, but it seemed right to offer. The bobcat sniffed, then turned away, curling tighter around its wound. Clayton nodded as if he understood. Yeah, I wouldn't trust me either. He poked at the fire, sending sparks swirling into the updraft. The wind outside whistled through the pines, and somewhere, far off, a coyote sang to the moon. A song of hunger, wildness, and longing. The sound echoed in Clayton's chest, and he realized with a kind of bitter awe that he was lonely in a way that no campfire or whiskey could cure. He watched the animal's eyes, strange, beautiful, golden with pain and memory. He saw in their depths something he'd never found in the eyes of men, a kind of unyielding, silent courage. The bobcat had survived the trap, the pain, and his hands, and now it stared back at him, refusing to break. He remembered Eli that last night on the mountain, his son's voice, shaking but strong. I can't do this anymore, Dad. I can't watch you kill just to feel alive. Clayton had shouted, furious, sure of his own righteousness. But as the echoes faded and the boy's footsteps vanished into the dark, a piece of him had gone with Eli, never to return. He looked down at the animal now and realized he was talking to both of them, son and bobcat, as if the act of tending this wild thing was a kind of penance. I guess it's too late for fixing things, he murmured, but I can try to save one thing before I go. The hours slipped by. He fed the fire, checked the bandage, dozed in and out of uneasy sleep. In his dreams, he was hunting, always hunting, but every creature he pursued turned into Eli, then Mary, then the bobcat, each with eyes full of sorrow and accusation. He awoke with a start, reaching for his rifle before remembering. No danger here, just the quiet, broken thing beside him, still alive, still fighting. Clayton wiped his eyes, not sure if the wetness was from the cold or something else. He found his notebook again, scribbled another line, more feeling than thought. You can't take back what you've done, but you can choose what you do next. Maybe that's enough. The fire burned low, the stars above wheeled across the sky, and the bobcat slept, its breaths a stubborn drumbeat in the night. For the first time in years, Clayton let his guard down. He wrapped his coat tighter, not to keep the cold out, but to hold in a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. A thin thread of hope, fragile as the dawn, that maybe, just maybe, a man could change before the end. Night pressed down heavy and close, but sleep wouldn't come for Clayton. Each time he shut his eyes, memories clawed at him. Mary's gentle voice, Eli's stubborn chin, the wild eyes of every creature he'd ever trapped or shot. The wind howled against the tent, tugging at the canvas, rattling the metal zippers. The fire was almost gone now, nothing but a soft red glow, just enough to outline the bobcat curled tightly against the cold. Clayton watched the animal breathe. There was something almost peaceful about the rise and fall of its ribcage, like watching the tide come in, then slip away. He envied it, the simplicity of being only what you were made to be, not haunted by regrets, not drowning in what-ifs, just here, just alive. He shifted, wincing as pain stabbed deep in his chest. The cancer was always there, a shadow he couldn't shake, growing bolder with every hour. He fumbled through his pack, found the battered tin box that held his most private things, a lock of Mary's hair, a photo of Eli at age 12, a dog-eared letter he'd written but never sent. The paper was yellowed, the words faded. He read it over in the dim glow, every line a memory, every smudge a reminder of how long he'd waited to reach out. He set it aside, pulled a fresh page from his notebook, and uncapped his pen. For a long while he just sat, staring at the blankness, the silence stretching out between him and the boy he'd driven away. Finally, he began to write. Eli, I never was much good at this. Writing, that is. Or saying what needed saying. I always figured a man's actions told the story. But I see now I was wrong. There's too much I left unsaid. I don't expect you to forgive me, not for everything. Lord knows, if I was you, I wouldn't. But tonight I sat by the fire, tending to a wildcat that got itself caught in a trap I should have pulled years ago. Guess that's fitting. I've set so many traps in my life. For animals, for people, for myself. Clayton paused, the pen trembling in his hand. The wind eased, the silence broken only by the bobcat's breathing and the distant cry of an owl. You always hated the killing, son. I saw it in your eyes. Every time I brought home a pelt or told you a story about outsmarting some coyote. I thought I was teaching you to be tough, to survive. Maybe I was just trying to prove something to myself. Maybe I was scared of being soft, of letting anything slip through my grip. I won't pretend I know what I'm doing out here. I'm tired, Eli. Sick. The doctor says there's not much time left. Funny thing is, the closer I get to the end, the more I wish I could go back to the beginning. To the mornings we hunted together, before I ruined it with my pride. He wiped at his eyes, more angry than sad. The words spilled out, raw and awkward, but real. Tonight, I chose to save something. Not for redemption. Hell, I know I can't buy that now. But because it felt right. I looked in that cat's eyes and saw myself, broken, trapped, afraid. I couldn't pull the trigger, not this time. I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe it's just for me. But I wanted you to know. I was thinking of you. Always have been, even when I didn't know how to show it. I wish I'd told you more. I wish I'd listened better. If you come looking, I'll be up at the old camp by the creek, the one with the big boulder that looks like a bear's head. If not, that's all right. Just know your old man tried, at the end, to do one right thing. Love, Dad. He set the pen down and stared at the letter, letting the words settle into the stillness. For a moment, he imagined Eli as he'd last seen him. Tall, thin, his eyes full of hurt and longing. He wondered if the boy was happy now, if he'd built a life untouched by his father's shadows. He hoped so, even if it meant they'd never speak again. Clayton folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and tucked it beside the fire where Eli might find it, if fate was feeling kind. He turned to the bobcat, still breathing, still alive. He thought of all the lives he'd taken, all the things he'd lost. He wondered if this one act of mercy could balance even a single weight on the scale. He wrapped himself in his coat and lay back, exhaustion flooding every bone. The pain in his chest was a steady, relentless drumbeat, but for once, it didn't scare him. He'd said what needed saying. Maybe it wasn't enough, but it was more than he'd ever managed before. Sleep crept in slowly. In his dreams, he saw Eli as a child, laughing on the hillside, Mary smiling beside him, the world green and wide open. He saw himself not as the hunter, but as the man he might have been. A father, a friend, a keeper of small mercies. The fire's glow faded. The tent was cold, but Clayton's heart felt warmer than it had in years. For the first time, he let himself hope. Not for forgiveness, but for understanding. The bobcat stirred in its sleep, a low, contented rumble in its chest. Clayton reached out, let his fingers brush the animal's fur, and closed his eyes. He whispered into the darkness, not sure if he spoke to his son, his wife, or the wild itself. I tried. That's all I can do. I tried. And the silence answered, holding him close until morning. Morning arrived with a pale silver light, filtering through the forest and breaking the long, black grip of night. Clayton lay on his side, arms curled around his chest, the cold gnawing at his bones. For a long moment, he listened, half expecting the wind to bring back Mary's voice, or Eli's footsteps, or even the desperate cries of the night before. But there was only the hush of snow, a world softened and silent, as if the mountain itself had paused to breathe. He coughed, struggled upright, and winced as pain burned through his chest. His first thought was for the bobcat, instinct and guilt woven together. He turned, eyes searching the small space beside the dwindling fire. The bobcat was there, still wrapped in the wool blanket. The wound was ugly, the bandage spotted with dried blood, but the animal was alive. Its chest rose and fell, shallow but steady, and its golden eyes glinted in the soft morning light. There was something different now, something proud and ancient in its gaze, a spark that said, "I am still here," in a language older than words. Clayton reached for his canteen, poured a trickle of water into a battered tin, and slid it gently toward the animal. The bobcat sniffed at the offering, then, with a weary caution, lapped a few drops. For the first time, Clayton dared to hope the creature might survive. He caught himself talking again, his voice low and gravelly. "You're tougher than I ever was," he admitted. "Got more fight in you, that's for sure." He sat there watching, the world outside the tent growing brighter with each passing minute. The ache in his chest flared again, sharp and mean, but he ignored it. He'd learned to live with pain. He'd just never learned to live with regret. The memory of his letter to Eli lingered, heavy and unfinished. He wondered if his son would ever read it. He wondered if, somewhere far away, Eli was waking up, looking out a window at his own piece of sky, remembering the mountains and the man who'd taught him to hunt, and maybe, just maybe, feeling a faint pull of forgiveness. The bobcat stirred, shifting its weight. Clayton noticed the animal's ears pricking at the sounds of the waking forest. Birds chattering, a branch snapping in the wind, the distant yip of a coyote. Something in the air had changed. He felt it too. A tension, a readiness, like a horse before the starting gun. He knelt, speaking gently. "If you're gonna go, you should go now, before the pain's too much, before the day grows old." He reached out, hesitated, then peeled back the blanket, exposing the bandaged leg. The bobcat pulled away, then stopped. It looked up at him, eyes unreadable, wild, and Clayton felt the old fear again, the one that said some things couldn't be mended. He opened the tent flap. Cold air rushed in, sharp as knives, smelling of pine and freedom. The bobcat tensed, muscles trembling beneath matted fur. For a long, suspended heartbeat, nothing happened. Man and beast regarded one another in the pale dawn, two survivors measuring the distance between them. Then, with a slow, painful effort, the bobcat rose. Its hind leg barely touched the ground, and its gait was awkward, but pride carried it forward, step by stubborn step. Clayton held his breath, watching as the animal limped to the edge of the tent, paused, and glanced back at him. Their eyes met, amber and blue, wild and weary, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. "You're free," Clayton whispered, voice rough and thick. "And so am I." The bobcat slipped into the trees, silent as falling snow, vanishing into the deep shadow and light. A wraith returned to its kingdom. Clayton watched until there was nothing left, no flash of gold, no sign at all except the faint trail of tracks in the snow. He sat back, heart thundering. The old ache in his chest felt lighter, almost bearable. It was as if some ancient weight had been lifted, some chain broken at last. He stared at the place where the bobcat had vanished, blinking hard. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. He packed up slowly, hands shaking, not from cold, but from a feeling he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or hope, or just the strange emptiness that follows after you've done something that matters. He doused the fire, scattered the ashes, rolled up the blood-stained blanket, and stowed his gear. Before he left, he took the letter to Eli, folded it carefully, and tucked it under a rock at the edge of the campsite, just in case. He stood for a while, letting the cold bite his face, watching the clouds chase each other across the pale sky. His legs were weak, his breaths shallow, but he felt stronger than he had in years. He shouldered his pack and started down the mountain, boots crunching over snow, following the winding trail away from the camp. Every step felt like an act of letting go, like forgiveness, slow and clumsy, but real. Behind him, the world seemed unchanged, quiet, cold, indifferent. But Clayton knew something had shifted. He'd come to the mountain with death at his heels, looking for a way to finish things on his own terms. He was leaving with something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace, fragile as spring ice, but bright as the morning sun. He paused one last time, looking back. The bobcat's tracks led into the trees, fading into the wild. His own footprints beside them were already filling with new snow. "Goodbye," he said, not just to the animal, but to everything he'd carried too long. Guilt, anger, the ache of being alone. He turned, walked into the dawn, and felt, for the first time, a little bit free. The wind had shifted. Days bled together as Clayton descended the mountain and then circled back, settling once more by the old camp, almost as if the woods themselves had chosen to cradle him for these final weeks. The cold deepened, biting sharper than before, but it no longer felt like an enemy. Just a fact of life, the way regret or memory pressed against the ribs at night. Clayton moved slower each morning, every breath a ragged effort. But for the first time in a long while, he stopped fighting it. The forest changed with the season's turn. Heavy flakes began to fall again, layering the world in white, muting every sound except the muffled snap of branches under the weight. Clayton would watch the snow swirl through the pines, the flakes catching light like a million tiny lanterns. He felt strangely grateful for the quiet, for the time to listen to his own heartbeat, weak but persistent, echoing in the hush. He didn't seek out new traps, didn't hunt or lay snares. He'd hang his rifle on a limb and let it gather frost. He spent hours by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sipping the last of the bourbon, letting himself drift between sleep and waking, memory and dream. Sometimes he thought about the bobcat. He wondered if the creature had survived, if it limped beneath the trees or lay curled beneath some fallen log, eyes half closed but alive. Other times, in the soft gray between waking and sleep, he saw the animal as something else entirely, a spirit moving at the edge of the woods, always watching, sometimes standing upright, sometimes merging with the trees, gold eyes burning in the dusk. Mary's voice returned to him now, more gentle than before, whispering through the sound of the wind. You can't change what you were, Clay. You can only choose what you become. He would smile at that, letting the warmth of her words seep through his bones. At night, the fire would crackle low. Clayton would lie back on his bedroll, eyes tracing the shadows on the tent walls, the patterns of ice on the canvas above him. The stars outside shone in the black Wyoming sky, so cold and distant he sometimes wondered if they'd outlast every wound, every sorrow, every trace of a man's life. He drifted often, memories tugging at him like gentle hands. He saw Eli, small and bright and full of questions, trudging beside him on the old trapline, boots sinking into the snow. He remembered Mary's hand on his shoulder, the quiet love in her eyes, the forgiveness she offered long before he could ask for it. The boundary between dream and waking grew thinner. He spoke to the ghosts as if they were old friends, telling them about the Bobcat, about the night by the fire, about the letter he'd written but never mailed. He found himself confessing to the mountains, to the wind, to anyone who'd listen. Redemption doesn't erase the past, he'd murmur, voice cracking. But maybe it changes the way you leave this world. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, the Bobcat would appear, amber-eyed and silent, moving just outside the firelight. Clayton would watch, unafraid. He understood at last what the wild creature meant. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or making things right. It was about choosing, moment by moment, to live differently, even if it was too late for second chances. He remembered what it felt like to kneel by the fire, tending the wounds of something he'd once tried to kill. How hard his hands had shaken. How the act itself, offering mercy instead of violence, had cost more than any shot fired or trap set. That, he thought, was what being a man meant. Not strength or control or pride, but the willingness to lay those things down. His health faded quickly as the final snows fell. He no longer left the camp except to gather a little wood. His breathing grew shallow. The world narrowed to the ring of firelight, the worn pages of his journal, the hush of snow falling on canvas. He wrote sometimes in fits and starts, other times with surprising clarity. Mercy and forgiveness are choices. They may come too late to change history, but never too late to bring peace to the heart. I thought I would die alone out here, and maybe I will, but the wild has forgiven me in its own way. I hope, wherever you are, Eli, you find that kind of peace. He read those words back to himself, not as a plea for pardon, but as a lesson he wished he'd learned sooner. He let the meaning settle into the silence, the truth that mercy was not a weakness, but a way to end an old cycle. That forgiveness was not for the dead, but for the living. The last fire he built burned long into the night, flames leaping higher than before. Clayton sat beside it, wrapped in every blanket he owned, staring up at the stars, listening for the soft pad of paws in the snow. He smiled, even as his body failed, because he finally understood what it meant to be at peace. Not unbroken, not unpunished, but accepted by himself and by the world that would go on turning, wild and beautiful and free. As sleep finally claimed him, he dreamed of the Bobcat, golden and whole, running ahead of him through the snow-laden pines, leading him onward, ever deeper into the heart of the wild. Snow had swallowed the mountain whole. It lay thick on every branch, blanketed every trail, and filled every hollow. The camp where Clayton Reeves spent his last days stood nearly silent under the white weight, just a faded circle of packed earth and old ash where the fire had burned. A week had passed since the last smoke rose above the trees, and now the world was so still it seemed time itself had paused out of respect. The only sound was the slow hush of flakes settling, one on top of another, building a shroud over every sign of human life. The searchers came when the snow eased, a pair of rangers from Sheridan, wordless and bundled against the wind, picking their way up the mountain with lanterns and shovels. They'd found the old Ford down by the road, frost covering the windows, a coffee cup frozen solid on the seat. They knew who it belonged to. Everyone in town did. Clayton Reeves had been a legend and a cautionary tale in equal measure, a man whose life was written in scars and stories. They found his camp easily enough, just as the sun began to push through the gray. The tent leaned at an angle, half buried, its fabric stiffer than leather in the cold. One of the rangers called out, "Mr. Reeves, hello?" But the only answer was the slow groan of the wind. Inside the tent, Clayton lay where he'd fallen asleep, boots still on, arms crossed as if in prayer or quiet surrender. His face was peaceful, eyes closed. The deep lines of worry softened into something almost young. The rangers paused, heads bowed, each feeling the hush settle on their shoulders. Next to Clayton was his battered old journal, pages filled with spidery handwriting, confessions and memories jumbled together. The last entry, written in a hand that trembled but never broke, read, "If you find this, know I didn't die alone. A wild creature forgave me, and I forgave myself." One of the rangers set a gloved hand on the journal, reading the line twice, feeling the weight of it. There was more here than just the end of a life. There was the end of a story, a cycle that had run for decades, only now finding rest. The other ranger stepped outside, brushing snow from his shoulders, his breath hanging in the air. He stopped short, staring down at the ground just outside the tent flap. There, pressed into the fresh snow, was a perfect ring of tracks, bigger than a house cat, smaller than a wolf. The four-toed prints circled the tent twice, then vanished into the trees, as if something wild had come to pay its respects. He called his partner over. Together, they stood in silence, watching the sun sparkle on the tracks, gold and new and utterly impossible. The Bobcat, they realized. The story was true. In town, the news of Clayton's death drifted through diners and feed stores, whispered over strong coffee and shared with the careful reverence folks used for men who had been both feared and respected. Some remembered him as the best trapper Sheridan ever saw, a man who could track a fox through a blizzard or bring down a bull elk with a single shot. Others remembered the fights, the drinking, the years after Mary died when he turned mean and hard, driving his only son away. But the story that stuck, the one folks repeated as the snow kept falling, was the last one. How the old man had found a bobcat in a trap, spared its life, nursed it back from death. How, at the end, the wild thing came back for him, left tracks in the snow, a sign, a benediction. In a place that lived by stories, this one mattered most. A preacher came to collect the body. He packed up the journal, the letters, the rifle. When he saw the bobcat tracks, he knelt beside them and closed his eyes, as if trying to feel what Clayton had felt in those last days. Regret, sorrow, and a strange, bone-deep peace. The preacher believed in redemption, but he also knew it was rare as gold in these mountains. Yet here it was, written plain in the snow. The rangers packed Clayton out on a sled, leaving the camp just as they'd found it. They took nothing but what belonged to the man. leaving the circle of ashes and the blanket where the bobcat had lain. As they moved down the trail, snow began to fall again, covering their tracks as quickly as they made them. That night, the wind scoured the camp, erasing what little remained. Only the journal, now in the preacher's hands, kept the story alive. He read Clayton's words by lantern light, his own breath catching on the lines. True peace isn't about escaping solitude, but making peace with who we've been and with the wild world we share. He thought about that, sitting alone in the church office. He thought about mercy, how it always arrived late but never empty-handed. He thought about how a man could change, even at the edge of dying. Out in the wilderness, the bobcat moved through the trees, limping but alive, a golden shadow gliding over the drifts. It paused once, looked back at the camp, then vanished into the heart of the wild, free and unburdened. In Sheridan, the talk moved on, as talk does, but the story lingered, tucked into the corners of memory, woven into the hush of snowfall, the whisper of pines, the tracks left in new snow. Some said it was just a tale. Others, the ones who knew how hard forgiveness could be, understood the truth of it. Clayton Reeves had not escaped his solitude, but he'd made his peace. And in doing so, he'd left the mountain a quieter, kinder place. Spring came slow to the mountains that year. The snow lingered in the shadows beneath the pines, melting by inches, not all at once. The world was waking up, but quietly, a gentle return, with the hush of meltwater and the tentative songs of birds. Where the old camp had stood, time seemed to have paused, holding its breath. It was nearly a year after Clayton Reeves' passing, when a pickup truck rumbled up the narrow mountain road, tires bumping over frost-heaved earth. The driver, a man in his late 30s, wore his father's eyes and his mother's gentle smile, though his face was leaner, marked by time and worry. His name was Eli, and in the seat beside him rode his own son, a boy of 8 with wild hair and a stubborn chin. Eli hadn't been back to these hills since the night he left. 15 years of distance, grief, and silence. But the letter had come to him by surprise, delivered months late by the preacher. Its envelope crumpled, the words inside faded but fierce. Eli had read it again and again, searching for the father he'd run from, the man he'd feared he would become. Now, with the first breath of spring on the wind, Eli brought his son to the place where the story ended, and maybe where a new one could begin. The two trekked the last mile on foot, boots squelching in mud and last year's pine needles. The boy ran ahead, calling out, "Dad, is this where Grandpa camped?" Eli nodded, his heart heavy and light all at once. They found the campsite by the half-buried boulder that looked, as always, like a bear's head. The tent was long gone, but the fire ring remained, a dark scar in the earth, rimmed by stones blackened with old soot. Eli stood in the middle, turning slowly, taking in the silence, the memories, the ghosts. His son knelt by the fire pit, picking up a small charred bone, maybe from a rabbit, maybe from a long-forgotten meal. He looked up, eyes wide. "Was Grandpa a hero, Dad?" Eli crouched beside him, his hands trembling just a little. He reached for the words, careful as a man handling glass. "Your grandpa was a hunter," he said quietly. "He made mistakes, big ones, hurt people, hurt himself too." He paused, remembering the anger in Clayton's eyes, the ache in his own chest, the way both of them had tried to fill silence with noise. But right at the end, he did something brave. He saved a wild animal. He chose mercy over pride, even though it was hard, even though it was almost too late. Eli smiled, brushing a leaf from his son's hair. Was he a hero? No, not like in the stories, but he made one right choice when it mattered most. Sometimes, that's enough. The boy frowned, thinking it over. Is that why you brought me here? So I could meet Grandpa? In a way, yes. Eli pulled a worn envelope from his coat and handed it to his son. He wrote you a letter, even though he didn't know you yet. He wanted you to know the truth, that people can change, that forgiveness is real, even when it comes slow. The boy traced the lines of his name on the envelope. Do you forgive him? Eli closed his eyes, letting the mountain wind pass over his face, carrying away a little more of the old hurt each time it blew. He nodded. I think so. I hope so. I'm still learning. Forgiving isn't something you do once. It's something you have to practice, like walking or climbing or being a father. They sat in the silence, letting the world move around them. The boy dug in the earth with a stick, making a new pattern in the ashes, while Eli read the words carved into the old boulder. Faint, but there. C. Reeves, E. Reeves, 2003. He smiled, a sad and hopeful thing, remembering the day he and his father had carved those initials, not knowing how hard the years ahead would be. As the sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the clearing, Eli rose to his feet. He pulled his son close. Let's walk, he said. They wandered into the trees, following the faint path of animal tracks pressed into the fresh spring mud. Dad, the boy said, skipping ahead, do you think the Bobcat is still out here? Eli grinned. I hope so. Some stories never really end. They just, change. Like people. They reached the edge of the trees, where the forest fell away to a view of the whole valley. Bright green and alive, a patchwork of sun and shadow. For a moment, father and son stood side by side, breathing in the wild air, the promise of new beginnings. Eli thought of his father, alone in his last days, searching for redemption, choosing mercy. He thought of the lesson he wanted to pass down, not just about hunting or survival, but about the courage it took to break a cycle. He squeezed his son's hand. You know, Eli said, his voice gentle but strong, this isn't just a story about a dying hunter and a wounded bobcat. It's a reminder that redemption, no matter how late, is worth pursuing. If you ever make peace with your past, or if you ever have to forgive yourself or someone else, don't wait. Do it now. Tell your story. Let it go. He knelt, looking into his son's bright eyes, seeing the future in their depths. Sometimes, the most powerful endings come from a single act of mercy. That's how you write a new story, one that belongs to you. The boy nodded, then darted off, chasing the shadows. Eli watched him go, the ache in his chest replaced by something softer, a quiet hope, the sense that maybe, just maybe, the wild had forgiven him too. He stood a while longer, feeling the mountains settle, the hush of the trees, the whisper of wind through pine needles. The world was wide and waiting. The old wounds were still there, but they no longer bled. They had become something else. Scars, reminders, proof that healing was possible. Personal reflection and call to action. For me, this isn't just a story about a dying hunter and a wounded bobcat. It's a story about how forgiveness, especially the forgiveness we offer ourselves, can heal even the deepest wounds. If you've ever found peace with your past, or if you're searching for it now, I hope you'll share your story, here or with someone who needs it. Sometimes, the most powerful endings are built on a single act of mercy. Remember, no matter how late it seems, it's never too late to choose forgiveness, to write a new chapter, to return home, changed and ready for whatever comes next.